Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're doing something really cool. We are decoding the ultimate map of life on Earth. We're going to take some of that complex biological jargon and turn it into a truly fascinating cartography of evolution. So if you've ever wondered how scientists actually managed to trace the lineage of every living thing back through time, well, you're absolutely in the right place. Let's get right into it.
We have an awesome itinerary ahead of us today. We're starting off with the ultimate family tree, then moving into the blueprints of evolution, mapping ancestors and descendants, learning the language of traits, and we'll wrap things up by looking at the sheer pacing of evolution itself. All right, part 1, the ultimate family tree and how to read the legend.
To read any kind of complex map, you first have to understand its basic legend and the core symbols it relies on, right? Well, on a phylogenetic tree, the absolute most critical symbol is the node. Think of a node as a literal fork in the road, where a single ancestral path diverges. It represents a speciation event, the exact moment a common ancestor splits into two completely distinct directions. And there's this beautifully simple mathematical rule that anchors all of this. The number of nodes on a fully resolved tree always equals the number of species minus 1. So if you have 8 species on your tree, you will have exactly 7 nodes. It's just a remarkably precise mathematical mapping of divergence.
Now, what's really fascinating is the core rulebook these evolutionary maps follow. They are deeply rooted in Darwinian ideas of common ancestry, and we always study these trees from low biodiversity to high biodiversity. Plus, they strictly follow the law of parsimony, which basically means the simplest explanation with the fewest evolutionary changes is usually the correct one. And when we bring fossils into the mix, they only ever set a minimum age for a lineage, not the absolute beginning. But honestly, my favorite rule is this last one. The physical layout on the page doesn't restrict the actual data. You can completely rotate the branches around a node, and the core evolutionary relationship stays exactly the same. The visual lines might twist around, but the underlying history doesn't change one bit.
Moving right along to part 2. Let's look at the actual blueprints of evolution, the types of trees we use. Just like a real-world cartographer has to choose between topographical or climate maps depending on what they actually want to show, biologists use different evolutionary blueprints to solve different puzzles. There are 5 major ones you should know. First is the dendrogram, which is just your simplest, most general term for any tree diagram. Next is the cladogram. Now this one only cares about the branching pattern. The lengths of its branches don't represent time or the amount of change at all. But if you do want to measure change, you're going to use a phylogram, where the branch lengths are directly proportional to the amount of character change that's occurred. If time is your main focus, you'll reach for a chronogram, which explicitly bakes time right into its branch lengths. And finally, the Dahlgrenogram, which gives us this really unique cross-section view of a phylogenetic tree. So yeah, every single tree serves a highly specific, unique purpose. Okay, so here is a crucial distinction. Understanding rooted versus unrooted trees. A rooted tree gives us a confirmed ancestor, a definitive, undeniable starting point. And because we know exactly where it begins, we can trace the evolutionary journey forward in a particular direction. An unrooted tree, on the other hand, shows us how different species relate to one another, but it leaves that starting line a total mystery. Because there's no confirmed ancestor, you simply cannot read an unrooted tree in any specific direction.
And this brings us to something that brilliantly illustrates the sheer mathematical explosion of biology. Just look at that number. Over 34 million. If you are mapping out the relationship between just 10 species, you can draw over 34 million possible rooted trees for just 10 species. It really highlights just how incredibly careful and precise scientists have to be when they're using data to find the one correct map out of millions and millions of incorrect possibilities.
So section 3. How do we actually map these ancestors and descendants? Let's talk construction.
How do scientists build this mind-bogglingly complex map from scratch and navigate through those millions of possibilities? Well, it's a very strict multi-step procedure. First up, you have to select your organism of interest. Scientists very carefully define their in-group. That's the specific taxa they are actively studying, and they separate it from the out-group, which acts as a reference point completely outside their immediate focus. Next, they collect an exhaustive amount of morphological and molecular data. And finally, they compare all this data to determine which traits are ancestral, meaning older and inherited, and which are completely newly derived.
To process all that data, they build what's called a distance and similarity matrix. They essentially tabulate traits using a binary system. Zeros represent a primitive or ancestral state, and ones represent an advanced or derived trait. So taking a look here, taxon A is all zeros,
meaning it represents the absolute most primitive state in this specific group. Meanwhile, taxon D has a total score of 3, showing us multiple advanced traits. This really elegant matrix turns physical and genetic characteristics into hard, measurable data that can be used to actually construct the branches of our tree.
But, grouping life based on this data isn't always perfectly straightforward. We classify groups in 3 main ways. A monophyletic group is your true family reunion. You select one common ancestor and you include absolutely all of its descendants. A paraphyletic group is a bit like inviting only some of your cousins to the reunion. You select one ancestor, but you leave a few descendants out. And finally, a polyphyletic group is essentially just a coincidental gathering. You select descendants from entirely different ancestors, but you don't include a shared ancestor at all. Knowing exactly which group you're looking at is vital for reading the map correctly.
All right, moving into part 4, the language of traits and decoding the labels.
So let's shift gears and focus on the specialized language our mapmakers use to label these changing roads of evolution. It's easy enough to spot a new trait visually when you're just looking at an animal, right? But biologists have some very specific, somewhat tongue-twisting terminology to describe these exact evolutionary upgrades on our maps.
The first major term you need is apomorphy. This represents an advanced or derived character. It is any trait that was not present in the last common ancestor, but has suddenly appeared in the descendants. It's a true evolutionary novelty. And when this derived novelty is shared among multiple descendants, we call it a synomorphy. Synomorphies are absolutely crucial because they act as definitive road signs, showing us that a whole group of species has moved down a brand new evolutionary road together.
On the flip side, we have plesiomorphy. Think of a plesiomorphy as inheriting an old family heirloom. It's a primitive, ancestral character that was present in the ancestor and simply carries over, relatively unchanged, to the descendants. Basically, it's a trait that has stuck around for the long haul.
But sometimes the map totally glitches out, and that brings us to atavism. Atavism is this incredibly rare ancestral reversal of a character. It's when an extremely ancient trait just suddenly reappears, like the rare occurrence of rudimentary tails or gill clefts in higher animals. It is such a fascinating and surprising phenomenon, and it reminds us that these ancient genetic blueprints are still hiding deep within our DNA, literally just waiting for the right switch to be flipped.
Which brings us to our final section, part 5, the pacing of evolution. We're talking slow crawls and sudden sprints.
We really have to ask, how fast is this incredible map actually being drawn over geological time? Here we've got the 2 major theories of evolutionary pacing squaring off against each other. On one side, you have punctuated equilibrium. This theory suggests evolution happens in short, rapid sprints of change, which interrupt these really long periods of evolutionary stasis where, well, nothing much happens at all. On a phylogenetic tree, this is represented by distinct, right-angled lines. On the other side, we have phyletic gradualism, which views evolution as this slow, constant marathon. It argues that new species arise by a steady, gradual transformation, and that's represented visually on our map by diagonal lines. The reality? Nature likely uses both of these pacings at different times. So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a really provocative thought to chew on. We've talked all about how these trees are drawn, the data that builds them, and the terminology of traits. But if you're mapping humanity right now, what new apomorphies, what advanced derived traits do you think scientists a million years from now will use to define our specific branch on the tree of life? Where do we currently sit on this ever-growing map, and what kind of legacy are we going to pass down? Definitely something to think about the next time you look at the natural world around you. Thank you so much for joining me today, and as always, keep exploring.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.